Welcome to day 2 of the New Future of Work Symposium. So I'm Gloria Mark, and along with Sean Rintel, we're organizing this event. So yesterday we started off the symposium with a great keynote by Susan David, who taught us the value of expressing and understanding our emotions accurately. This was followed by 4 pioneers in the area of HCI, CSCW, and work who presented thought-provoking ideas of how we can live in our current and future times. We are a virtual conference, so we're not likely to bump into each other in a hallway like we would at a regular conference. Tom Malone addressed this problem by offering us Mingler, a system to support informal interaction, which many people used yesterday. Virtual conferences are new. We're still learning, and we like to shuffle things up a bit to create a little bit of spice. So today we're going to have a different program with a panel, highlighted talks, and themed discussions. Enjoy. So turn it over to Sean.
Thanks, Gloria. So let's get started right into the panel. And we're talking today about the inclusive future of work. And that's because we know that diversity and inclusion are not only increasingly important, but increasingly also visible in academic research and in corporate research and explorations of work and the way the businesses frame the way they want to do work and the way they want to be seen, but in the way work is genuinely done. But we know that there's quite a long way to go. And there's a lot to actually even understand about what inclusion really is and what diversity really means in ways that aren't sort of purely trying to say that everything fits in the same bucket. It isn't about homogeneity. So what do we need to understand from prior research to really take forward diversity and inclusion in the new future of work? And what do we have to do to not repeat the mistakes of the past? And what kinds of challenges and opportunities are going to arise? So we've asked 4 people who are all excellent researchers, corporate researchers or academic researchers, and also people who work in business to talk to us about inclusion in various different kinds of ways. I'll turn it over to Gloria to start introducing our panelists.
Okay, thanks, John. So our first panelist, Tawanna Dillahunt, is professor at University of Michigan School of Information. She runs the Social Innovations Group. She's won numerous paper awards and is a Cavell Fellow with the National Academy of Sciences. She's a real pioneer in the area of technology to address inclusion. She designs, builds, deploys cutting-edge technologies that solve real-world problems, particularly in underserved communities. Sean?
Sure. We now also have, I guess it's going to be Stuart Duff is the partner and head of development at Pearn Kandola. He's stepping in for Binna Kandola, who unfortunately wasn't able to be with us today. But Stuart is a great psychologist in his own right, who's been looking at remote work for a long time. And he wrote and edited the I Lead Tools, which is 3 books focusing on how to develop people and tasks and thought leadership skills. And I think leadership is a critical thing that we need to think about in the inclusion sphere. We also have Gregg, who's the chief technologist for UX and sustainability at Intel. She's a reformed academic. She used to be exploring the technology of work-life boundaries. She wrote a great book called Work's Intimacy, which I'm a huge fan of. And just a couple of years ago, she also wrote another book which explored received models of productivity called Counterproductive. Now she's working at Intel to guide the user experience of PCs that help us navigate this tricky world of moving between work and home life.
Okay, and our last but not least panelist is Oliver Haimson. Is an assistant professor at University of Michigan School of Information. He's the recipient of an NSF Career Award. His research area is in social computing, where he focuses on studying how social media is used by people in changing identities during life transitions. His research goal is to impact technological inclusion of marginalized users. Sean?
All right, so now we're just going to lead off with Tawanna. Each speaker is going to give just a 3 to 5 minute position statement, and then we'll open up to questions from you. Or in fact, you can ask questions while they're talking. They'll be fed to them, and then we'll get the panel talking amongst one another and to you as well. So Tawanna, when you're ready.
Thanks so much, Sean, and thanks so much to the two of you for inviting me as a panelist here. So I'm just going to take 1 second to share my slides. So the first thing that I'd like for us to do is just to take a second to acknowledge our positions and our advantages. To meet virtually like this requires unlimited internet access that's somewhat stable. Most of us are here for work, which means we're employed and we're earning an income. And navigating teams, I have to admit, requires a high level of digital proficiency. So what a blessing. Today, I'll discuss job seekers who don't share these same advantages and who we must not forget. So for context, most of my research has taken place in the United States and specifically in southeastern Michigan and Detroit. Now, it's important that I call out that the population is majority Black and the regional poverty and unemployment rates are higher than other parts of the United States. The median annual income is around $28,000. This was before COVID. And while nearly 80% of the population have a high school degree or higher, fewer than 14% have a bachelor's degree or higher. So our team uses a wide range of methods, some traditional like surveys and interviews, but we also, as Gloria mentioned, deploy existing tools as well as build our own in-house tools. We use participatory approaches and engage with community partners. So our goal is to investigate how digital tools and technologies could lead to employment among job seekers within the aforementioned demographics. In our qualitative work conducted before the pandemic, we found that our populations face challenges including high educational costs of training, which prevent them from upskilling. They have limited access to technology and low digital literacy. They have limited trust in technology and receive very little feedback in their job search. They also have very few social connections who could provide them with job search feedback. Now, to see whether our findings generalized, we recently conducted a survey of 770 US job seekers in the February to March timeframe. We wanted to understand how job seekers were using digital tools in their job search. We've now started to follow up with some of the hardest hit job seekers in interviews, and these are people who earn less than $30,000 per year. And perhaps unsurprisingly, we find that the pandemic has exacerbated previous issues and surfaced new ones, including underlying health issues, disabilities, mental health challenges, and limited social support, which is more important than ever. Job seekers are telling us how frustrating it is not to have feedback and to see jobs disappear literally as they apply for them online. Many job seekers risk looking for jobs outside of their homes. And so we identify crucial technology-related issues. First, the infrastructure required to search for jobs and to apply to jobs, to interview with employers and to work, they solely depend on online platforms. Further, audit studies and other past research shows that these platforms are inherently biased, which further disadvantages job seekers. So what are these job seekers doing? Many Metro Detroiters have searched outside of established firms in response to unemployment and pursued entrepreneurship. However, our past research shows that technologies have done little to support racially minoritized entrepreneurs because of a mismatch in business models between what the technologies provide and the needs and values of these entrepreneurs. Local farmers, for instance, are stepping in as trusted community members to fill infrastructural gaps by delivering produce versus relying on online delivery. Now, this creates new opportunities to design inclusive technology. And to do so, we need to remove our assumptions that job seekers are like us and consider ways to support those who are filling these infrastructural gaps. We need to take advantage of opportunities to support populations that have been systematically oppressed and ignored, and consider how to design technology that builds on existing community resources, capacities, and values. With that, I'd like to thank you and turn it over to the next speaker.
Great, thanks, Tawanna. Stuart, do you want to give your position statement?
Thank you very much. Thanks, Tawanna. Thanks, Sean. Thanks, Gloria. My name is Stuart Duff. As Sean said, I'm a partner at a firm called Pearn Kandola. We're based in the UK, but we work globally. And I've spent the last 25 years of my career working in leadership and coaching. And as a business, we are passionate about diversity and inclusion and fairness in the organization. About 10 years ago, I was approached to conduct a piece of research with a global telecoms business who had invested a considerable amount in technology, but were finding that there was very much a lag in the behaviors of employees and leaders in taking up that technology. And the big question on their mind is kind of what's going on? You know, what is the psychology to working in a dispersed way? Why is it that we're seeing a slow take-up of technology? And that started several years of research looking at when people move from centralized to dispersed teams, how do they respond to that at an individual level? How do leaders lead teams that are dispersed, that they can't be with on a daily basis? And how do we use technology in different ways to improve that experience? And as I say, all of the focus, whether it was interviews or questionnaires that were completed, was about the psychology, the underlying psychology of what's going on in remote teams. And subsequently, we've run and designed leadership programs to help managers to think about exactly that. As they move into remote teams, how do they get the best out of their teams? And I think some of the findings that I'm very happy to touch on over the next 50 minutes is really around how we build trust with teams. How do we build trust with individuals? You know, over the last 4 months, I think a lot of us have experienced a removal of that very, very important connection that we have with people when we are face-to-face in a room or in the same organization, in the same office space. So how do we build relationships? How do we communicate effectively? How do we avoid some of the conflicts that perhaps arise? We certainly saw a lot more anger and frustration arising in remote teams. But also there were some genuine individual differences in the way that we adapt to remote working and work in teams as well. So it's not as straightforward as saying, okay, get the technology right and everybody can work remotely. There's a lot of learning. There are more competencies to learn, but also there are personal motivations and personal styles of approaching our work that either help that or get in the way sometimes. So again, I'm sure a lot of us have learned a lot over the last 4 months in terms of our own style of working relentlessly, remotely. And I guess the final point I touch on is we were looking at international teams. So there are cultural differences in the way that we work within teams and the way that we contribute to teams, the way that we make decisions. So I'm very, very happy to touch on each of those points and to talk about some of those findings as we go through. Sean, Gloria.
Fantastic. Thanks, Stuart. Next up, we have Mel Gregg.
All right. Well, I'm also going to try and share some slides here. Let me see. Do I have the option? Let's see. Can you tell me if I am sharing, please?
You are sharing.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. So as Sean mentioned, I'm Melissa Gregg. I work at Intel. I run a small team of fantastic user experience researchers who I think are on the line in some cases. So glad to see that they were excited to join us in this big conversation today. So I wanted to share a little bit about my background for those of you who haven't met me before, although it is a little bit of a nice return to the academic world, meeting some of these big scholars in the field that have inspired me over the years. I come from Bruny Island, Tasmania. This is a photo of me looking out to Antarctica, which is the next stop from where I grew up. And one of the things that I've always done professionally is try and make sense of the world as somebody who's sort of outside of the traditional job. So here, growing up on Bruny Island, there weren't any formal workplaces really. And so I've spent a lot of my time as a scholar trying to understand how people learn to be professionals. So the first couple of books that Sean mentioned were studies of the changing nature of work because of technology. And you'll see on the cover of this book, the woman who's attached to her laptop may be quite familiar to some of you at this point in time, having worked from home for many months now. And the research that I did as an ethnographer in academia was to establish, some of these key concepts of work-life blurring and what I called in that book presence bleed. When the office can follow you home, how do people start to make new distinctions about what's their professional performance and what's more personal territory? I think the thing that's struck me in the last few months as we start to see a new recession unfolding is the synergies between this earlier study I did, which actually hit on the global financial crisis back in 2008, and the sorts of productivity pressure that we're seeing professionals demonstrate. Those who are lucky enough to continue to have work are showing signs of almost a survivor's guilt that they're wrestling with, so that they're actually maintaining a very high workload and in some ways a displacement activity from the reality that we've been discussing, as Tawanna also mentioned, of some really major challenges for people to even have employment at the moment. So, you know, perversely, I've now become something of a commentator on survival strategies for working from home, and this has been a shock to me in the last few months. But in our research at Intel, one of the things that we've been trying to understand is what is the new hierarchy really, and the new opportunity in a workplace that is now fully distributed. So we've just finished some research which has been looking at the experience of workers who are in lockdown during this period, and just what that means, that intensity of all work relationships now coming through your laptop. It's wonderful work that I've been lucky to do with Stripe partners, some great collaborators out of London. And so what we're seeing is a kind of irony where, you know, initially back in 2008, when I did that earlier study, the freedom to work anywhere was what was being celebrated with mobile technology. Now what we're seeing in our research is actually this desire to stay in one place, to find the ideal place in the home if you have that opportunity. And as you'll see here in the diagrams from some of the research participants, you know, spending 95% of the time in the spare bedroom with cat number one, if you have the opportunity to have a home office. And of course, what I wanted to sort of draw attention to here, given the context of this discussion, is this is only a certain number of people in the world who are going to have the ability to have this amount of predictable space. You can probably hear the lawnmower outside my window right now. Every time I give a talk remotely, the lawnmowers come outside of my window. I can't predict that, even though this is the best setup for me in my home office. So interesting to see what kinds of people are surviving and flourishing in this environment. And here's just one I thought I'd pull out for discussion, because we're seeing a big difference also, as Stuart mentioned, that personalities who are already quite confident and independent and autonomous in how they get their work done, people who are sort of agile and results oriented and have a sense of purpose, are quite happy, it seems, in this transition. But what we've also noticed is that people who aren't accustomed to this level of autonomy, people who are expecting more direction and interaction with peers and managers, are having a much harder time. So implications for the future of work, I think, are that we're going to see a new kind of elite. This is also a snapshot from the study that we did, which was from someone working in the Bay Area. So again, very constrained apartment here, somebody who's talking about it's difficult to see what difference it makes, which employer you have at this point in time, because all of that social and cultural dimension to work has been stripped away. And it's really the same game with a different uniform, depending on who's given you your last stash of goodies in the recruitment drive. So a new elite is forming who may be able to play employers off each other in terms of the sorts of goods, services, benefits, and privileges that will come with the job. And this older model of work, which was, you know, very much about the corporate hierarchy, you know, bumping into the boss in the elevator to get your point across or do the literal elevator pitch. Post-COVID, who's going to want to be in an elevator? And I just wanted to end with this image, because I do think that the way in which we think about space and resources and assets, and which companies have invested in those, may be starting to change as a result of this incredible situation we're in. Hopefully, my big hope is that they will eventually start to realize and finally start to realize that employees are their key assets and will invest in workers in a new way. So I'm going to be a Pollyanna in my final in my final words. Thanks very much, Sean.
Thanks, Mel. That was fantastic. We're going to now switch over to Oliver, who is going to talk to us about a very different kind of inclusion.
Thanks so much for inviting me today. I'm going to share some slides here. All right, can everyone see my slides all right?
Yes.
Great. So I'm going to be talking today about a transgender inclusive future of work and what that could look like. But I wanted to start off with a few statistics about trans employment. So in the US, trans people are 3 times more likely to be unemployed than the general population. And this is a statistic that's probably amplified quite a bit by the pandemic. And it's also worth noting that this is actually higher for trans people of color. So for example, Black trans people are 4 times more likely to be unemployed than the general population. So in some participatory design sessions that my research team conducted recently, we asked trans people about the challenges that they face. And one important category that participants discussed was work-related challenges. So these are in participants' own words. They talked about unemployment, joblessness, lack of supportive and uplifting and trans-inclusive workspaces, job applications that were using only binary genders, and also capitalism. So some of these were in a position to change more easily than others. So I don't think that we're going to be able to make big changes to capitalism right now, but I'd love to see a future of work in which trans people have the same opportunities as everyone else. So I'm going to review some best practices in each of these areas. And really, this is just scratching the surface. So if you have questions or if you'd like more detail about these, I can talk about that later. So when we're thinking about trans-inclusive hiring, a few things come to mind. So first, employment applications can be a lot more trans-inclusive. So this, I'm showing here some best practices for how to ask about gender on something like an employment application to be more inclusive. Another thing is acceptance of mismatched identity documents. So during gender transition, often someone's driver's license, social security card may not match with each other or may not match with that person's current gender identity. So this is something to not question, but really just accept during the hiring process. And then finally, it's important to hire trans people. So I think a lot of people on this call probably are in positions to make employment decisions. And it's important to just understand that you do have implicit biases against trans people and just acknowledge that and move on and make employment decisions that are more inclusive. So I wanted to talk about some ideas for how to make trans-inclusive workplaces, both in the physical world and then in more remote work instances as well. So in physical world workplaces, trans-inclusive policies can include things like restroom access, trans-inclusive dress code, correct name and pronoun usage, supporting gender transitions through policies, through healthcare, and also trans-specific diversity training. And in each of these, it's important to include trans people in building and running these initiatives. But we know that things are quite a bit different now with most people working from home. And so there are some new considerations for how to create trans-inclusive workplaces for remote work. So one is to be flexible with camera policies. For instance, some trans people really will not want to show their physical appearance, for instance, if they're experiencing a lot of dysphoria at that time. But some people really will want to show their appearance, for instance, if they're excited to display a new gender presentation. Next, it's important not to gender someone based on their voice. A lot of times with trans people, one's voice doesn't really match their current gender identity. So rather than deciding something like that based on a voice, it's important to really just listen to what someone's gender is. And this is important when you're having calls that are maybe voice only without video. And then finally, remote work can be more trans-inclusive if it includes higher levels of privacy. And then finally, I wanted to talk about trans identity disclosure. So when and how to come out at work is really a major consideration for trans people, and this is not something that should be taken lightly. This is a graph from some of my research, which was quantifying the average sequence of trans identity disclosures. And so you can see that workplaces are right in the middle of this graph. So it's important to understand that the work audience is just one of many along a complex series of trans identity disclosures. So thanks so much. And I wanted to note, Mel had this tweet, no need to wait for the future to get started on this. So this is something that we can get started on right now. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you, Oliver. I think Gloria is now going to lead off with the first question.
Yes. Okay. Thanks to the panelists. That was really great. So I actually wanted this first question to tie into our keynote presentation yesterday. Susan David talked about the importance of acknowledging all emotions. And there is this common culture that people should be happy, positive people. But I wanted to ask you about the role of anger in making change to promote inclusion. And anger can be very productive, but the expression of anger can also lead to repercussions for people, especially in the workplace. So I wanted to ask your thoughts on how people can express emotions, particularly anger, productively that could lead to change. So I'd like to open it up to the panelists. Who wants to take a stab?
Sorry, Gloria, I'm very happy to step in there and I guess pick up on some insights that we gained through interviews with leaders and teams. And that focused in particular on conflict at work and conflict within teams. And what was very interesting to us is that pretty much every leader that we spoke to said that conflict is a normal, everyday part of working life. You know, if you're going to make decisions, if you're going to take actions, if you're going to try to make change happen in a workplace, then conflict is a natural, normal experience. But the one thing about moving to dispersed teams that really shocked pretty much everyone we spoke to was how unpredictable that conflict becomes. So they talked about kind of, in a work environment, you can see, you can read, and you can feel emotions when you are working with people. And that gives you a good indication as to whether people are engaged in the decision you're making and in the conversation you're having. And you can pick up on those. Most people can pick up on those when you're in a meeting, when you're in the same room. And as we move into more of a remote or dispersed environment, actually there was far less data to work with, far less information coming from individuals. So suddenly a decision would be made that would create all sorts of conflict, and very difficult conflict, because I think anger, frustration would have been building for some time, and there wouldn't be that vent. So those leaders who really knew how to manage this actually used face-to-face and video as far more than using basic levels of communication around email, pushing their views. They understood the preferences of their own team for communication rather than using their own preference, which is often email, because let's face it, it's quicker, it's easier for me to talk to my team by email. But actually that investment in time, that investment in seeing people and having conversation allowed, I guess, some of that anger to be expressed more appropriately, more healthily between teams. So it was an observation that came out of the research.
Okay. Anyone else want to join in?
I can jump in. I can chime in. Yeah, I really appreciated yesterday's talk and the importance of accepting our emotions and not, feeling like everything has to be positive. I would say that, not everyone has the has the advantage or privilege to be able to express their emotions in the same way. So, me being a Black woman, there's a stereotype of being an angry Black woman, which might actually get me fired, right? So I have to be careful about how I express, anger. But I agree that, honing in on that anger and finding productive ways to move forward, whether or not it's moving your team forward, whether or not it's moving our society forward. I mean, I think that's something that we should all, reflect on and really think about, like, what are we going to do with this anger and how can we use it in a productive way?
Thank you.
Yeah, I wanted to add on to that. I think there should be room for more emotions and for anger in the workplace. I don't think this is something that's going to change overnight, but I think especially when you're considering marginalized populations who faced years of oppression, years of discrimination in hiring processes, it's not that someone's going to get hired and just everything's going to be happy and great. So I would love to see a future of work that does have more room for emotion, not just anger, but all kinds of emotions. I don't necessarily think that that's something that should be as separated from the workplace as it is.
Mm-hmm.
Do you want to chime
I'm
in
not
on
going
this?
to say anything because as an affect theorist, I will get very delayed, and this may be the only question that we get to. All I would say is to the point about emotions being appropriate in the workplace. Obviously, there's a lot of literature on this about how that cool subjectivity of the white collar worker has been constructed over time. But I also think that a little bit of Sara Ahmed is very important when we're talking about emotions, because if you are especially working in the diversity and inclusion field, that wall that you hit when you are trying to make change in large institutions is very apparent. And so I think there are moments when anger is necessary. And I also think it's important to call out when the cool subjectivity of polite discourse isn't going to get you the result that you need. And like Sara, I think I also believe in the idea of withdrawing labour when you aren't seeing change. So instead of getting yourself personally exercised as if it is an individual thing that you are trying to ameliorate for your workplace, find a better workplace.
Safe had a really great question. She asks, what are some of the advantages that job seekers from low resource environments might have over individuals from more privileged environments? And how might we leverage those advantages for the labour technology that we co-design with them? Anyone like to take that one?
I can jump in. Thanks, Saif, for your question. I think this is a great question. I would say core values, sticking to your core values, resiliency, the ability to work in environments without having stable access to internet. I guess that's creativity. Definitely, is I would say is an advantage, or a skill that job seekers from lower income areas have. But again, that creativity and entrepreneurial efforts. Like I've seen local farmers kind of step in and deliver produce to their neighborhoods. Again, thinking about values, the community values, and not doing this for money, but they're doing it because their community needs it. Now they're receiving money for it, but that's not the sole reason why they're doing it. So I think that's an advantage, is not losing these core values.
Anybody else want to jump in on that one?
Yeah, I can add a little to that. So I think mostly there's not advantages. I think mostly disadvantages, but I will say there's some aspects of community organization that are different. Like for instance, in the trans community, there's an organization called I think it's Trans Tech Enterprises that kind of brings people together and tries to get trans people, especially trans people of color, hired in tech jobs. And I think that this is something that works because there is, some sense of community around this group.
Anyone else? Well, I'll jump in with another question. And this question is about social isolation and inclusion in the time of COVID. So, Oliver, your work with social media has shown that tech has advantages in helping people transition their identities. And we know there's lots of other examples of how technology can help marginalized people. Tawanna's work certainly addresses this. But in the time of COVID, when people are working at home and they're socially isolated, how does that affect inclusion and marginalized populations, and what can we do about that?
Yeah, I can speak to that. So I think that specifically with trans populations, I think that this is a group that's really good at, finding community and resources online. And, even before the pandemic happened, a lot of people were actually experiencing isolation just because, at some points in transition, people don't feel comfortable going, out in public. There's a lot of violence that happens in public spaces for trans people. And so I think that in some ways this isolation is, I don't want to really say normal, but I think it's something that the trans people have learned to live with. And so I think finding community and finding support online is huge sometimes for marginalized populations.
Yeah, I'd agree with that, and maybe just add a couple of observations from the research we've recently done, because if we are talking about the range of personality types and contributors who make up a workplace, it's not all bad news, right? I mean, in some ways, I think we're also seeing a bit of a revenge of the introvert right now, because those who have benefited from those, pally conversations in the hallway, or being able to follow someone through to the bathroom to have a conversation and get your project approved, or get your latest idea in front of someone. Like, these are themselves privileges of physical presence. And so what we're seeing in the working remotely situation is a new leveling. Everyone has to use this device to get their point across. And we're also seeing far less use of cell phones and other kinds of conversations, because not least because of Teams, right, which we were all using this morning. There's a new platform, and that is creating new kinds of coercive sociality, not necessarily on everybody's preferred terms. What it offers as an opportunity for technologists, and what we're certainly looking at in our team, is a way to draw attention to the patterns of interaction that are marginalizing. So the fact that, the loudest voice is often privileged in the video conferencing tool, or the fact that people, again, to go back to that idea of withdrawing labor, if you're not happy with the boss right now, you can just not talk. And it makes really awkward meeting interactions. So instead of the currency being chat and being social, there are new ways that people, I think, are exercising their power and their maybe their lack of interest in cooperating with certain kinds of surveillance and certain kinds of dictates that managers are struggling to issue through digital technologies. So yeah, just a little bit more context there for the range of opportunities as well as the disadvantages of isolation.
Okay.
Yeah, I can also quickly chime in. Thanks, Oliver and Mel. I appreciate everything you just said. I just want us to remember the job seekers, at least the ones that we've worked with, were already socially isolated, and this is worse. So I think one thing we can do is, I've seen in the chat, how can we bridge? How can we teach someone how to use, an online platforms like Teams? right? To check in every now and then, right? Just to say hello. I mean, I'm finding from the students who are interviewing the hardest hit job seekers that just the chat, just the interview itself, is allowing people to reflect on the job search and to really think about, who they are as job seekers and what strengths they really have. Many just haven't had an opportunity to talk it out with anyone. So I think there are lots of opportunities for us to bridge.
Okay.
And just to add that and pick up on Mel's point about the revenge of the introvert, part of our research did look at personality preferences and styles of working, and not surprisingly, there was a disparity in terms of those with more introverted preferences. I don't want to kind of over-categorize introverts, but those who perhaps relish the opportunity to work away from a busy office environment and have more time and space themselves. Yeah, I know that feeling. Compared to those who reach out actively for social support and networking. And unfortunately, I think we're still in a position where leaders make the assumption, or many managers and leaders make the assumption that actually if you're quieter, you don't want that regular reach out. You don't want that regular kind of Microsoft Teams connection. You want to be left alone. And that in itself is a big risk, because that's further marginalization of somebody who is perhaps kind of needing more support or regular conversations. And we do see that extroverted type personalities are more assertive, more sociable, will thrive more in a remote environment, oddly. It seems counterintuitive. It certainly was to us at the time. But it's because of that effort to reach out.
There's a couple of questions here that I thought sort of brought together Mel's idea of coercive platforms and how we deal with those. One was from William Jones, about whether inclusivity includes concerns about older people and an aging workforce and how they are going to deal with these kinds of platforms. And then another one from Martin White was also asking about the impact of working 100% digital on people with dyslexia. So there's a number of different kinds of groups, all of whom are specifically, potentially at least, not included by virtue of moving to digital platforms for all sorts of reasons. I wonder whether folks on the panel have any particular points they could make about those.
Plenty, yes. I think just to, again, think about that from the data that we've been collecting, there's often a talk about the workplace being now like full of the sandwich generation, right? That there's so many generations in the workplace now, there's so many layers. What that also now implies is that there are so many heritages of technology adoption. So many lineages of how people learn to be professional using certain kinds of interaction techniques. And so, if you listen to Stuart Butterfield, who's currently trying to keep Slack afloat in spite of the onslaught of Teams, he will say, the people who choose Slack are people who are accustomed to having this IRC history behind them, and they know how to use it appropriately. So you're not always being pinged and notified, but you're actually just staying abreast of the information that's most relevant to you. Try and get somebody who's in their 60s to use Slack versus Teams versus email versus picking up the phone. Like with my dad, I still voice call him on video with my mobile phone. He still holds it to his ear, and I spend a lot of the conversation talking to his ear and seeing the hairs, and it's not really effective. So there's a whole set of assumptions I think we make as technologists that have to be checked about how coherent the rollout of IT can ever be, right? And so I think part of what we also need to appreciate as humanists too is that we shouldn't have to force people onto one platform. But getting back to that idea of when is an employee a resource for the organization or a liability, companies haven't necessarily made that investment of a variety of communication channels. It's not in their financial interest to do that, and it's often not in the interest of the enterprise and its security regulations to do that, right? So this is why I often say enterprise UX is the place where we need to have the most work done right now, but we are facing some pretty strong forces when it comes to designing for the range of preferences for that sandwich generation.
I think another important group that we should talk about when we're thinking about the future of work is actually crowd workers and this global workforce. So I'm thinking of, Mary Gray's important work about that. So these are people who, face a lot of the same challenges that everyone else faces, but they also don't have a lot of, the rights and benefits and like job security that workers deserve. So I just wanted to briefly bring that up.
Anyone else?
I don't know if this is helpful, but when we talk about age, what we do tend to kind of draw into those stereotypes around use of technology and adoption of technology. But I think a much better prediction is actually somebody's openness to experimenting with new ways of working, and that's inherent whether you're 70, 80, or 17. And I see younger people who are less adoptive of certain technologies, just because of a particular mindset happening around them. But it's actually determined more by their. Oh, looks like I've been bandwidth issues.
That's okay. We can hear you.
And anyone else want to jump in?
No, I just second everything that everyone said so far.
Okay, great. So I'm going to ask a big one. So if you could wave a magic wand and change anything, what do you think should be the biggest policy change that could be made in the future of work that can promote inclusion?
This isn't going to be super big or anything, but I am speaking on behalf of those who I've, my population. And, the one thing that I've told my team that I would love to see is, more transparency in the hiring process and feedback. I mean, how mentally, challenging is it to apply for something and never hear back at all? You have no idea what's going on. And I mean, even for us, we don't know why we weren't hired. Again, I haven't put a lot of thought in the question, but that is one policy thing that I just think we need to think more. We need to think more about that.
Well, I would do that annoying thing of saying it depends what you mean by policy and who's in charge of defining it, because in many ways I have a little more faith right now in US corporations defining equity in the policy of hiring than I do the federal administration, especially when it comes to the issue of trans rights, and a lot of my colleagues who routinely are coming to us on our Out in LA Leadership Council to have reassurances that their benefits and their legal status will continue to be recognised, no matter how quickly the current leadership in the political realm is prepared to throw those rights away. So the thing that I have come to terms with, I think, since I've moved into a corporate setting is that obviously with great power comes great responsibility, as Spider-Man taught us. But I think that there are opportunities for corporations to lead the way in creating the right sets of equity considerations and diversity considerations when hiring. Because if you're expecting a federal government to do that right now, I'm not optimistic.
Yeah, I would agree with that. So I think it's great that we have, anti-discrimination laws, but the problem is that to actually prove that something is employment discrimination is a huge burden, and it's a process that very few people are actually going to go through. So I think that in addition to, policy changes, I think we need ways of actually enforcing those policies that we don't currently have.
Stuart, anything to add? You're on mute.
I completely missed the question, Gloria. Apologies. Just as I was talking about technology, I got booted off by the broadband here.
The question is, what, in your opinion, what's the biggest policy change that you would like to see in the future of work to promote inclusion?
Wow, that's a great question. I guess we get involved in a lot of assessment and selection, and I think there are many issues inherent in the attraction and assessment of candidates into organisations. That, at the very start of any pipeline, that is probably the biggest block in terms of biases. So it'd be legislation to tackle that, to promote greater diversity and inclusion there.
Okay, thanks.
Fantastic. Well, we've come to the end of the session. This has been absolutely amazing, and there's loads of questions actually still to be asked in the Q&A, and we can pass those on to our presenters, and they can hopefully get back to you on some of those. And so also loads of foods for thought for our later sessions. So on behalf of Gloria and everyone else, the rest of our team here, I really want to thank our tremendous panel, Oliver, Tawanna, Mel, and Stuart, for coming and giving us just incredible food for thought this morning. And really helping us think about inclusion, I think, in much more diverse ways than perhaps we'd even started the morning. So that's actually fantastic. Next up, for the rest of the day, we have, well, for the next 2 hours, you have a couple different sessions. Right up now, after this session, after a break, you are then all going to split off into 2 highlighted tracks. You'll choose either the session facilitated by Gloria or by myself to watch 4 talks in each. There'll be a talk and then Q&A, talk and a Q&A in each of those. Then you'll have another 5-minute break, and then you go into your themed discussions. That will also all happen in the channels within Microsoft Teams. So what you now need to do is to go into Microsoft Teams and find your way to one of those 2 highlighted track sessions. If you have any difficulties at all, remember that our phenomenal admin, Jen, is just an @Jen away. So email her or @Jen her within Teams to get any help that you need. And once again, I just want to thank our tremendous panel. As Gloria said yesterday, typically at the end of a session like this, you'd hear thunderous applause. Unfortunately, we can't have that thunderous applause, but just please let's all thank them very much and imagine that applause is going on. We really appreciate everything that you did for us this morning. Thanks again.
Thanks, you guys. You did a great job.